The rain came down in soft sheets over East Harlem that night, turning the streets into glistening rivers of grime and reflection. It was the kind of rain that made the city look cleaner than it was, a temporary illusion washing over cracked sidewalks and broken dreams. Somewhere in a tenement building on 108th Street, a young boy pressed his face against a fogged-up window, watching the lamps flicker in the distance. His name was Francesco Castiglia, but the world would one day call him Frank Costello, the gentleman of the Underworld. He didn't know it yet, but he was watching the beginning of an empire. The city outside was divided between those who worked for survival and those who worked the system. In the smoky backrooms of Harlem's bars, power wasn't earned through good intentions or hard work. It was taken, stolen, and traded in whispers. But little Frankie wasn't like the other boys. He didn't fight for scraps in the alleyways. He watched. He listened. And in silence, he learned. His parents had come from Calabria, southern Italy, chasing the fabled American dream. But like most immigrants, they found themselves trapped in a nightmare instead. His father worked as a day laborer, his hands cracked from cold mornings and hard stone. His mother prayed to the Virgin Mary each night, her rosary beads worn thin from hope. Their apartment was small, the walls thin enough for every argument and every secret to pass through. From those walls, young Frank learned how people sound when they're desperate, how their voices shake when they're afraid, how they change when they want something. School never interested him. The streets did. The corners of East Harlem were a classroom of another kind, full of boys who carried knives instead of books, who stole to eat and fought to live. Frankie joined them not because he was cruel, but because he was curious. He wasn't big, but he had something far more valuable: composure. He didn't shout when others did. He didn't panic when the cops showed up. Even then, he had that calmness that would later make him untouchable. By the time he was a teenager, Francesco Castiglia had already learned the most important rule of survival. It wasn't about who was the toughest. It was about who was the smartest. He began running errands for small-time gamblers, delivering envelopes, collecting small debts, carrying messages between men who never trusted the postal service. In those errands, he saw how money flowed through the city like blood through veins, how every bar, every cop, every politician had a price. There were men who ruled Harlem in those days: Irish, Jewish, Italian, all fighting for a piece of territory. Frankie didn't have a territory. What he had was understanding. He listened to how the big men spoke, how they laughed when they lied, how they promised protection in one breath and plotted betrayal in the next. He realized something that would guide him for the rest of his life. Fear fades, but respect endures. You can only scare a man for so long, but if he respects you, he'll never turn on you. It was during those years that he met a boy named Charlie. Charles Lucky, Luciano. Both were immigrants, both hungry, both tired of being treated as outsiders. Where Luciano had fire, Costello had ice. They were opposites, but they fit together like the pieces of a gun. One the trigger, the other the steadying hand. Together they began to imagine something bigger than petty crime. They saw a future where the underworld could be run like a business, organized, efficient, profitable. But before the dream came, the dirt. Frankie got his first taste of real money through bootlegging. It was the early 1920s, and prohibition had turned honest men into criminals overnight. The government had banned alcohol, but the city still thirsted for it, and wherever there's demand, there's profit. Frankie saw it as simple math. While others fought turf wars over corners, he was negotiating routes, shipments, and police payoffs. He partnered with Jack Legs Diamond and other rum runners, making deliveries up and down the East River. He wore sharp suits even then, always clean, always composed. The newspapers called men like him gangsters. He preferred businessmen. He didn't drink much himself. He didn't need to. He was intoxicated by control, by the quiet satisfaction of watching chaos obey his order. But every rise in the underworld comes with shadows. Cops were everywhere, and so were rivals. Frankie got pinched a few times for carrying concealed weapons, once even served a short sentence. It wasn't the time behind bars that changed him. It was the realization that prison was filled with men who'd confused anger for power. He decided that if he ever went back, it would be as a man too smart to be caught. When he came out, the boy from Harlem was gone. What emerged was Frank Costello, A man who could sit in a bar with thieves and dine the next night with politicians, and neither would question his place. He learned the art of image. His hair was always slicked back, his suits tailored to perfection, his shoes polished until they gleamed. He spoke softly, with the confidence of someone who didn't need to prove himself. Even when others lost their tempers, Costello never did. That calmness, that elegance, earned him a nickname whispered in both admiration and fear: the gentleman. The bootlegging racket grew faster than anyone imagined. Trucks filled with Canadian whiskey crossed the border under the watch of men who'd been bought and paid for. Speakeasies popped up across Manhattan, and Costello's product flowed freely through them all. It wasn't long before he became the financial brain behind Luciano's operation. While Luciano dreamed of uniting the Italian gangs, Costello was already thinking bigger, about influence beyond crime, about politics, about making crime invisible. By the mid-1920s, Costello's world had transformed. The Harlem tenement was a memory. Now he walked into nightclubs where jazz music drifted through clouds of cigarette smoke, where movie stars brushed shoulders with mobsters, where the line between legitimate and illegal blurred under dim lights. And yet, for all the noise, Frank Costello was the quietest man in the room. He watched how power worked, not in the back rooms with guns, but in City Hall with signatures. He understood that real power was not in bullets, but in the ability to make the law bend without breaking it. He began donating to political campaigns, cultivating friendships with police commissioners, judges, even governors. When a raid threatened one of his establishments, a single phone call made it disappear. This was the beginning of something larger than even he could imagine. Costello had found his weapon, charm. He didn't threaten, he persuaded. He didn't demand loyalty, he inspired it. Men who worked for him did so not out of fear, but out of belief that under Costello, things would run smoothly. He was a gangster, yes, but one with manners. In an era when bloodshed was the language of the underworld, Costello spoke the dialect of diplomacy. While Al Capone's name made headlines drenched in violence, Costello's name stayed behind the curtain, quietly pulling strings. That anonymity was his armor. The government couldn't indict a ghost. Still, even ghosts have enemies. The streets never forget a man who climbs too high. Some saw him as too refined, too cautious, too unwilling to get his hands dirty. But those who underestimated him didn't last long. Frank didn't need to pull a trigger. He had others who did it for him, not because he ordered them to, but because they wanted to. That was the true power he'd discovered, making men act out of loyalty, not fear. At home, his life seemed oddly ordinary. He married Loretta Geigerman, a strong, intelligent woman who came from outside his world. Their marriage was long and quiet, filled with unspoken understanding. She knew who he was, and he knew she didn't approve. But Loretta loved the man, not the myth. Their home in Manhattan was elegant, but not extravagant. Another sign of Costello's restraint. Even his enemies admitted he wasn't greedy, just calculated. In those years, he became the invisible thread tying together every racket from Harlem to Louisiana. Gambling, liquor, unions, construction, everything flowed through him at some point. And yet, the police could never quite catch him. He was always one step ahead, his name rarely on paper. His voice never recorded, but under that polished exterior, the boy from Calabria still lived. The boy who had watched the rain fall over Harlem and dreamed of control. He remembered what it felt like to be powerless, to watch others dictate your fate. Every deal he made, every connection he built, was another layer of armor against ever feeling that helpless again. He began to understand something few gangsters ever did, that fear builds empires fast, but they crumble faster. Respect builds slowly, but it lasts. His empire was built on that principle, one handshake at a time. There was a story often told about Frank during these years, about a young enforcer who came to him asking for permission to kill a rival. The man was angry, certain it was the right move. Frank listened quietly, then asked, "What do you get out of it when he's dead?" The man hesitated. Frank smiled, poured him a drink, and said, "Then maybe he's not worth killing." The enforcer left confused, but the rival lived, and months later, that same rival became one of Frank's most loyal allies. That was the difference between Costello and the rest. Where others saw problems to be solved with bullets, he saw opportunities to be solved with patience. By the time Prohibition ended, most gangsters faced ruin. Their biggest source of income dried up overnight. But not Frank Costello. He had already diversified into gambling, construction, and political influence. He didn't panic when the liquor stopped flowing. He simply shifted his focus to new streams of money. Slot machines, for instance, became his gold mine. He filled bars and clubs across the city with them. And when New York banned them, he simply moved them down to Louisiana, where politicians were more accommodating, even at a young age. Frank understood that adaptability was survival. The underworld rewarded those who could change with the times. He was no longer the errand boy of Harlem. He was a strategist, a chess player sitting miles away from the board, yet somehow always winning. At night, when the city quieted, Frank would sometimes step out onto his balcony, a cigarette glowing between his fingers, and look down at the streets he had once roamed barefoot. The wind carried the faint sounds of jazz and laughter from a nearby club. He'd smile to himself, not out of pride, but satisfaction. The kind that comes when you realize the world you once feared now moves to your rhythm. He had come far from Calabria. From the dirt roads of his homeland to the concrete maze of Manhattan, Frank Costello had reinvented himself, not through force but finesse. And though the city didn't know it yet, a new kind of power was rising. A quieter kind, a kind that didn't need to scream to be heard. The rain that once blurred the streets of Harlem now washed over skyscrapers built on deals he'd helped make. And as lightning flickered above the East River, somewhere in that city of shadows, a legend was being born. A legend that would shape the underworld for decades to come. By the time the 1920s began to fade into memory, Frank Costello was no longer the boy running envelopes through Harlem's alleys. He had become something else entirely. A man whose voice carried more weight than a gun, whose handshake could seal an empire. The city around him had changed too. New York was a furnace of ambition, burning hotter than ever, and those who survived the flames were the ones who learned how to control the heat rather than escape it. Costello was one of those rare few. He didn't just survive it, he mastered it. He found himself at the heart of Lucky Luciano's growing organization, a brotherhood that sought to reshape organized crime into something less chaotic and more efficient. For decades, the old Sicilian, bosses ruled by tradition and superstition, bound by rituals that made sense in the hills of Palermo, but not in the skyscraper shadows of Manhattan. Luciano saw that the world was changing, and Costello became the man who would help him turn the old world into a new one. While Luciano plotted alliances and territorial control, Costello became the bridge between the streets and the suites. He began working closely with Meyer Lansky, the quiet mathematical genius who could make numbers dance, and Benjamin Bugsy Siegel, the charming firebrand who could make anyone believe in the impossible. Together, they were rewriting the code of American crime, no longer just a tangle of ethnic gangs fighting for corners, but an empire of shared interests and divided profits. Costello's gift was understanding people, what they wanted, what they feared, what they could be persuaded to overlook. He had a way of making men feel seen, even as he manipulated them. He didn't threaten, he reasoned. He didn't command, he suggested. That made him dangerous in a way no thug with a pistol could ever be. Because when Costello wanted something, it rarely felt like an order. It felt like your own idea. When Prohibition ended in 1933, thousands of gangsters across America panicked. Their fortune had been built on illegal liquor, and now the Golden River was dry. Some went broke, others turned on each other. But not Costello. He had seen it coming long before the repeal. While the rest of the underworld was still celebrating, easy money Costello had been planning for the next era. He had diversified his interests: illegal gambling, slot machines, real estate, and most importantly, politics. In New York, he controlled hundreds of slot machines scattered through bars and clubs, earning nickels that piled up into fortunes. When Mayor Fiorello LaGuardia came to power and declared war on the slot machines, smashing them in public displays, Costello didn't panic. He simply moved his machines south. He found willing partners in Louisiana, where politics was looser, law enforcement friendlier, and money even more persuasive. The man who once dodged police raids now dined with governors. Frank Costello had discovered the true source of untouchable power: legitimacy. The kind that doesn't come from bloodshed, but from influence. He didn't bribe policemen anymore. He funded their commissioners. He didn't threaten mayors. He helped elect them. When questioned about his associations, Costello always smiled and said, "I'm just a businessman." But his business wasn't just gambling or politics. It was the subtle art of control. He saw how the law could be used as both shield and sword. He owned judges without ever signing a check. He influenced votes without ever showing his hand. In smoky rooms and lavish dinners, he became the quiet force behind decisions that shaped the city's future. The press began whispering his new title, the Prime Minister of the Underworld. By the mid-1930s, Luciano's dream of a national syndicate had taken shape. The Mafia was no longer an unstable collection of violent men. It was a government unto itself. There was a hierarchy, a council, and rules of conduct. And in that new order, Frank Costello became indispensable. He wasn't the kind of boss who shouted orders or spilled blood. He was the man others turned to when things went wrong, when negotiations broke down, when diplomacy was needed. If Luciano was the visionary and Lansky the strategist, Costello was the statesman. He could sit across from a rival boss and make him feel respected, even as he maneuvered him into submission. He knew how to use words like weapons, each syllable precise, each pause deliberate. His patience was terrifying. While others raged, he waited, and when he finally spoke, people listened. Behind closed doors, Costello began building something larger than a criminal enterprise. He was creating stability, an invisible order that allowed business to flow smoothly, avoiding the chaos that had destroyed so many before him. He saw violence as bad for profits. Every war, every murder brought attention, and attention was poison. He preferred peace, but not out of kindness, out of calculation. Peace meant predictability, and predictability meant profit. His relationships with politicians deepened. He became close with Tammany Hall figures, men who understood that sometimes the best way to govern was to cooperate with those who could not be removed. In return for campaign donations and quiet favors, Costello's friends in government looked the other way. Licenses were approved, investigations went missing, raids were canceled. To the average citizen, Costello was invisible. To the powerful, he was indispensable. He became a fixture in elegant hotels and private clubs, his presence understated yet magnetic. He was often seen in the company of prominent businessmen and judges, always dressed to perfection, his hair immaculate, his voice calm. Reporters who caught glimpses of him described a man who didn't fit the image of a gangster. There was no swagger, no gold rings, no loud laughter. He looked like a banker, spoke like a diplomat, and lived like a man who already knew he had won. Yet, beneath that polished exterior, the same Harlem fire burned quietly. He never forgot what it took to climb from the gutters to the penthouses. He had seen too many men destroy themselves with greed or vanity. Costello wanted something different. He wanted to leave a mark without leaving a mess. His partnership with Luciano deepened during these years. The two men shared an unspoken understanding. They were builders, not destroyers. Together, they established connections that extended from New York to Chicago, from Havana to Los Angeles. Luciano handled the enforcement and international ties, while Costello ensured that the political and financial machinery at home kept running smoothly. When Luciano was later imprisoned and exiled, Costello didn't crumble. He adapted again, stepping quietly into a more dominant role within the commission. He didn't claim the title of boss, but everyone knew who was really in charge. When disputes arose between families, it was Costello who mediated. When politicians needed discreet favors, it was Costello who arranged them. The 1940s were his golden decade. War and chaos consumed the world, but Costello thrived in stability. He controlled vast gambling interests and had loyal allies across the country. He avoided the bloody headlines that doomed other mobsters. To outsiders, it seemed he'd found a way to live above the law, untouchable and almost respectable. But in truth, he lived with constant vigilance. In the shadows, rivals watched, jealous of his quiet influence. One of them was Vito Genovese, a man who had once served under Luciano but dreamed of ruling alone. Genovese saw Costello's diplomacy as a weakness. his sophistication as betrayal of their roots. To him, the Mafia should be ruled by fear, not charm. And though Costello knew the man's ambition simmered, he underestimated just how deep the hatred ran. For now, though, Costello was content to play his role, the calm within the storm. His empire ran like clockwork. He had police on payroll, judges on speed dial, and senators on his Christmas card list. The average citizen might have thought America was run from Washington, but the wise ones knew better. Some decisions were made over mahogany desks on Wall Street. Others, whispered over a glass of scotch in Costello's apartment, shaped the nation in quieter, darker ways. Still, power never sleeps, and paranoia never leaves. Late at night, when the city dimmed and the jazz fell silent, Costello sometimes sat alone in his study, a cigarette glowing between his fingers, wondering how long it could last. He knew history's rule too well. Every king eventually meets his usurper. He thought of Luciano in exile, Siegel dead in his Beverly Hills home, Lansky chased by the law. He thought of his youth in Harlem, when power was a dream and trust was a currency he could afford to give. Now, trust was a luxury he couldn't buy. Everyone around him smiled too quickly, agreed too easily. The air of loyalty had grown thin, but even in his doubts, Costello remained what he'd always been, the calm center of chaos. If fear was coming for him, it would find him waiting, well-dressed and unshaken. For a man like Frank Costello, the rise to power was never just about money. It was about dignity, the ability to command respect in a world that respected no one. In that sense, he had already won. The streets that once spat on the name Castilla now whispered reverently about Costello. He had rewritten his own fate, not through violence, but through willpower, intellect, and a kind of moral code that made him more philosopher than criminal. And yet, every legend carries the seed of its fall. In the quiet glow of his Manhattan apartment, Costello could feel the shift in the air. Rivals were multiplying, the government was growing bolder, and the public had developed an appetite for spectacle. The days of invisible kings were ending. Soon, the spotlight would find him, and no amount of elegance could protect him from what came next. For now, though, the Prime Minister of the Underworld sat in silence, savoring his empire's calm before the storm. The city outside pulsed with the rhythm he had set. Deals were made, fortunes exchanged, promises broken, all under the watchful, invisible eye of Frank Costello. He poured himself another drink, looked out over the skyline, and allowed himself a rare smile. Everything, for the moment, was in perfect order. The mid-1940s in New York carried the scent of change, the kind that unsettled men who had built their empires on secrets. Frank Costello, sitting at the center of his invisible web, could feel that change moving toward him like a quiet tide. The war had reshaped the world, and with it came new appetites, new dangers, new faces hungry for the kind of power that once belonged to only a few. Yet while others scrambled to reclaim lost ground, Costello stood steady, the calm in a storm that never seemed to touch him. He had become something rare, a gangster who didn't need to shout, a criminal who didn't need to run. The newspapers called him the Prime Minister of the Underworld, and in some strange way, they weren't wrong. He had everything. Money flowed endlessly from his gambling operations, from the slot machines humming in the smoky corners of Louisiana bars to the illegal bookie joints hidden in Manhattan's basements. His influence reached into City Hall, into the police department, into the courts. Politicians owed him favors they could never repay. Cops took his calls before they took orders from their captains. Judges, senators, businessmen, each one at some point had been touched by Costello's quiet generosity. He didn't rule through violence, he ruled through necessity. Everyone needed him, and that was his greatest weapon. In private, though, Frank had little interest in the titles others gave him. He saw himself as a mediator, a man who kept the peace between wolves. His goal wasn't domination, it was control. He had seen too many empires collapse under the weight of their own greed. Luciano, once the king of New York, was now living in exile in Italy, his name spoken in the past tense. Meyer Lansky had fled the country's tightening noose. Bugsy Siegel was dead in a Beverly Hills mansion, and Vito Genovese, the man who had spent years biding his time, was growing restless again. But for now, Costello ruled an empire without firing a shot. He lived in a penthouse apartment at the Waldorf Towers, surrounded by quiet luxury. His days began with coffee delivered on a silver tray, the newspaper folded neatly beside it. He'd read through the headlines slowly, savoring the knowledge that behind half of those stories, his fingerprints were invisible but real. He'd take calls from politicians, greet businessmen in tailored suits, and settle disputes between mob families with the calm patience of a judge. To outsiders, he seemed untouchable. But the underworld is never content with stillness. Beneath the surface, cracks were forming, tiny fractures that would one day become fault lines. It began with whispers, the kind that travel faster than truth. Men began questioning Costello's leadership. Some thought he had grown too comfortable, too close to the politicians, too far from the blood and dirt that built the Mafia. They said he had gone soft, that he'd traded respect for vanity, that his love for refinement had dulled his instincts. Those whispers had a name attached to them: Vito Genovese. Genovese was everything Costello was not: loud, ruthless, and power-hungry. He believed in ruling through fear, not diplomacy. To him, Costello's polite conversations with senators and mayors were acts of betrayal. Genovese had once fled to Italy to escape prosecution, but by the mid-1940s he was back in New York, and he wanted the throne that Luciano had left behind. Frank saw it coming. He always did. But for all his foresight, he had one blind spot. He believed his ability to reason could save him from violence. He thought that every problem, even in the Mafia, could be solved through understanding. That was his greatest strength, but also the seed of his undoing. Despite the growing tension, Costello continued to expand his empire. Gambling was his art form, and he was its quiet painter. His reach extended into Cuba, where American tourists flocked to casinos that glittered like promises. He invested heavily, sending money and men to Havana, where Luciano's old connections still ran deep. For a time, it seemed like paradise: money, luxury, and security. The Mafia was evolving, and Costello was at its head, orchestrating deals that tied organized crime to legitimate business like vines to a tree. But paradise never lasts. The American government, eager to prove its strength after the war, began turning its eye toward corruption. Investigations sprouted like weeds, committees forming to root out organized crime's ties to politics. And Frank Costello, the man who had made politics his shield, suddenly found himself under its scrutiny. The Kefauver Committee, led by Senator Estes Kefauver, was created in 1950 to expose the connection between crime and government. It was broadcast live on television, a national spectacle. Millions of Americans watched in fascination as one underworld figure after another was dragged before the cameras. Some broke, some lied, some vanished. But when Frank Costello's turn came, the country held its breath. He walked into the courtroom wearing a gray suit and a calm expression. The cameras weren't allowed to show his face, only his hands. But those hands told the story. They moved slowly, deliberately, sometimes clasping together, sometimes fidgeting with a cigarette or a glass of water. His voice was soft, cultured, nothing like what the public expected from a gangster. He didn't deny knowing powerful men. He didn't even try to hide his influence. But when asked about his wealth, he said only, "I paid my taxes." The line became famous. It was the kind of answer only Costello could give, polite, evasive, and brilliant. But while the public was captivated, his appearance marked the beginning of his unraveling. He had always operated best in the shadows, unseen and unrecorded. Now the entire country knew his name, and for the first time, he couldn't control the narrative. The hearings embarrassed him. They also emboldened his enemies. Genovese saw weakness in the way Costello had handled himself. To a man like Vito, being questioned by senators wasn't just a threat. It was an insult to their entire world. He began consolidating his forces, aligning himself with those who believed Costello's time had passed. Meanwhile, Frank's health began to decline. The years of constant stress, long nights, and quiet paranoia were taking their toll. He spent more time at home, away from the spotlight, his once impenetrable composure cracking in small, almost invisible ways. But even as his energy faded, his mind remained sharp. He knew what Genovese was planning. He could feel it coming closer every day, the inevitable clash that had been building for years. Then came 1957. It was a warm spring evening when the bullet came. Costello had returned home from dinner, his mind heavy with thoughts of business and betrayal. As he entered the lobby of his apartment building, a man stepped out from the shadows. Vincent, the Chin Gigante, a loyal soldier to Genovese, raised a gun and fired. The sound echoed through the marble hall like thunder. The bullet grazed Costello's head, slicing across his scalp. He stumbled, fell, blood spilling down his temple. The doorman screamed. The shooter fled. Costello, dazed and bleeding, somehow got back to his feet. When the police arrived, they found him sitting calmly, pressing a handkerchief to his wound. They asked him who had done it. Costello, ever the gentleman, simply said, "I don't know. Let's not make a federal case out of it." That single line became legend. It was both defiance and resignation, a symbol of his grace under fire. But beneath the calm, he knew the truth. His time was over. Surviving the attempt wasn't victory. It was a message. Genovese had sent it, and Costello understood it perfectly. Not long after, he made a decision that shocked the underworld. He stepped down. No grand speeches, no revenge, no bloodshed. He simply walked away. He gave up control of the family, handed the reins to Genovese, and retired quietly to his life of wealth and anonymity. The man who had once ruled the Mafia through influence and respect faded from its hierarchy without a single protest. To some, it looked like surrender. But to those who truly knew him, it was the final act of a master strategist. Costello had built his empire on intellect, not violence. He had survived longer than almost anyone else, not by fighting, but by knowing when to stop. In the years that followed, he remained a figure of fascination. He was called to testify again, questioned by authorities, but he never broke the code. He never betrayed anyone, never named names. The Kefauver hearings had shown the world a man who could face interrogation and emerge with dignity intact. Even his enemies respected that. He spent his final decades quietly, walking the streets of Manhattan, visiting old haunts, sipping scotch at his favorite restaurants. People would nod respectfully when they saw him, unsure whether to smile or cross the street. He still dressed impeccably, still carried himself like the prime minister he had once been. But there was a sadness behind his eyes now, a weariness that came from outliving the world he helped build. He had seen it all. The rise of Luciano, the fall of Capone, the birth of Las Vegas, the corruption of politicians who once pretended to be clean. He had built his life on understanding people, and in the end, he understood one final truth. No man, no matter how clever, can outwit time. Still, there was pride. He had lived on his terms. He had never been caged, never humiliated, never broken. Even in his twilight years, the city bowed to him in small, invisible ways. The maitre d's who always found him a table. The cops who tipped their hats. The businessmen who still sought his advice in whispers. In a world that celebrated chaos, Frank Costello had been the quiet force of order. He had turned crime into civilization, violence into politics, greed into art. He had ruled with words instead of weapons, and when his story finally began to fade, it did so not in tragedy, but in quiet triumph. The years after the assassination attempt were a strange kind of peace for Frank Costello. To the newspapers, he had retired. To the government, he was a relic of an older, subtler mafia. To the men who once feared him, he was a ghost that still cast a long shadow. But to himself, he was something else entirely, a man between worlds. He was neither fully legitimate nor truly criminal anymore. He lived in that fragile in-between space where men who have seen too much often find themselves, haunted by memory, but driven by the need to stay relevant, to stay alive. Each morning began the same way. The Waldorf Towers apartment, quiet, immaculate, and filled with reminders of a life lived in control, woke with the soft hum of the city outside. Costello would rise early, dress carefully even if there was nowhere to go, and have breakfast served on fine china. It wasn't vanity, it was ritual. Routine had kept him alive for decades, and now it was the only structure he could trust. After breakfast, he would sit by the window, looking down at Park Avenue, watching the world he once ruled move without him. He was still visited, of course. Old friends came by, men with names that once carried weight. Lawyers, politicians, a few remaining soldiers from his old operations. They came for advice more than companionship. Some wanted to know if they should invest in new ventures. Others just wanted to hear him talk, to feel the calm authority he exuded. But even in these small meetings, Costello could sense the distance. The underworld had changed. The new generation was louder, bloodier, and far less refined. They didn't see crime as a craft. It was chaos now, ruled by paranoia and greed. The television brought him daily reminders of that shift. Every few months, there'd be a headline, a new shooting, a family war, a boss indicted. Vito Genovese had taken over what was once Costello's empire, but his reign was poisoned from the start. Genovese's hunger for total control had made him careless, and within a few years, he found himself in prison, convicted on drug charges. Costello, upon hearing the news, simply smiled. It wasn't gloating, it was inevitability. He knew that men like Genovese always burned themselves out. Still, there was no joy in it. The world had grown smaller for Frank. His old allies were dying off one by one, either in prison cells or hospital beds. Luciano, his closest friend and rival, passed away in Naples in 1962, his heart giving out at the airport. When Costello received the news, he didn't say much. He just poured himself a drink and stared out the window. There was a heaviness in the air that night, as if another piece of the old order had finally fallen away. It was that same year when Costello began reflecting on what it had all been for. He had money, more than he could ever spend. He had power once, though now it existed mostly in memory. But happiness? That was harder to measure. He thought of his wife, Loretta, who had stood by him through everything, through trials, rumors, and endless nights of waiting. Their marriage had survived the kind of strain that destroyed most men. She had loved him in silence, never asking questions, never prying into his other life. She was his one link to something pure, something uncorrupted. And in his later years, she became his anchor. Sometimes, when the nights grew long and the city's lights blurred into a distant glow, he would think back to the streets of East Harlem, where it all began. The dirt roads, the shouting vendors, the smell of bread from the corner bakery. He remembered running through those alleys as a boy, hungry and angry at a world that gave him nothing. Back then, survival was all that mattered. He never set out to be a gangster. It had just been the only path that made sense. But now, looking back, he wondered if that path had been worth the cost. The truth was, Frank Costello had always wanted respect more than power. He wanted to be seen as a man of influence, not intimidation. That's why he had chosen refinement over brutality, diplomacy over dominance. He wanted to prove to the world, to himself, that even a gangster could have class. But as he grew older, he realized something cruel. Respect built on fear fades when the fear disappears. Once he stepped out of the spotlight, the whispers stopped, and the world moved on without him. The 1960s brought new kinds of chaos. The Mafia, which he had helped shape into an organized, structured network, began fracturing under its own weight. The Appalachian meeting in 1957, which had been intended as a grand summit of mob leaders, ended in disaster. Police raided the gathering, arresting dozens of high-ranking figures and exposing the Mafia's existence to the entire country. For decades, the mob had thrived on denial. It was rumor, myth, the thing polite society pretended not to see. But now, it was headline news. And though Costello hadn't attended that infamous meeting, its failure symbolized the death of his vision. A world where crime was controlled, discreet, and almost civilized. He spent much of his time gardening now. It was something few people expected of him, but he found solace in it. The act of tending to something living, of nurturing rather than manipulating, brought him a peace that business never could. He would spend hours among the plants, pruning and watering, his hands, once used to sign deals that shaped empires, now covered in soil. It was as if he was trying to grow something good out of the ground that had once buried so many lives. Every now and then, a journalist would try to reach him. They wanted his story, the confessions, the secrets, the truth behind the legend. But Costello always refused interviews. Let them guess, he'd say. They make better stories that way. The truth was, he knew his story had already taken on a life of its own. People saw what they wanted to see. A gentleman gangster, a criminal philosopher, a relic of a lost age. Maybe they were all right in some way. Maybe none of them were. In the late 1960s, the FBI increased its efforts against organized crime. Wiretaps, surveillance, informants. It was a new kind of war. one that didn't involve bullets but microphones and paper trails. Costello, though largely retired, found himself under watch again. Agents followed him, hoping to catch him slipping, but there was nothing to find. He paid his taxes, kept his meetings social, and never discussed business. The man who had once manipulated senators now spent his evenings reading the paper and listening to Sinatra records. But despite his quiet life, there were moments when the old fire flickered. When someone disrespected him, a slight remark, a careless comment, his eyes would darken. His voice would drop into that cold, steady tone that had made even killers hesitate. He might have been old, but the aura of command never left him. He carried it like a second skin, invisible but undeniable. One night in 1970, he attended a small dinner in Little Italy with a few old acquaintances. The restaurant was dimly lit, the air thick with cigarette smoke and nostalgia. Someone raised a toast to the old days, to the men who built the foundation of everything that came after. Costello lifted his glass, his hand steady. "The old days," he said quietly, "were never as good as we remember. We just had fewer regrets then." The table went silent. They all knew what he meant. As the years passed, the names of new bosses began to dominate the headlines. Gambino, Colombo, Bonanno. Costello read about them with a detached curiosity. They were different breeds, products of a harsher time. There was no subtlety left, no diplomacy. The new generation saw violence as the only language worth speaking. To them, a man like Costello was ancient history, a relic of a time when power was something you earned with words, not bullets. Yet even as his relevance faded, his legend grew. The public was fascinated by him. Writers called him the gentleman of the underworld, a phrase that made him chuckle whenever he heard it. He didn't see himself as a gentleman. He saw himself as a survivor, someone who had learned to adapt, to bend without breaking. And maybe that was his greatest accomplishment. In his final years, Costello rarely left the city. He preferred the quiet corners of Manhattan, where the old buildings still whispered stories of another era. Sometimes he'd be seen walking alone near Central Park, his overcoat neatly pressed, a fedora tilted just so. Strangers would pass him without a second glance, unaware that they were walking beside one of the most powerful men who ever lived in the shadows. He passed away in 1973 at the age of 82. The news broke quietly, almost reverently. The obituaries spoke of him as a mystery, a contradiction, a man who lived like a king but died like a philosopher. There was no grand funeral, no parade of mourners, just a small gathering of family and a few loyal friends. Even in death, he maintained the dignity that had defined his life. Frank Costello's story wasn't one of brutality or bloodshed. It was one of transformation. He had taken the chaos of the criminal world and given it a shape, a language. He had proven that power didn't have to scream to be heard. And while the world of crime continued to evolve without him, it still carried his fingerprints in every deal made behind closed doors, in every handshake that sealed a secret pact, in every man who believed that respect was worth more than fear. In the end, Costello's greatest trick was not surviving the gunfire or outsmarting the law. It was fading away on his own terms, quietly, like smoke leaving a darkened room. His legacy wasn't written in violence, but in the silence that followed him. The man who once ruled New York's underworld had become its ghost, a reminder that sometimes the most dangerous men are the ones who never raise their voices. In the years after Frank Costello's death, New York City changed beyond recognition, but his shadow never truly left. The city that had once moved at his command now belonged to a different breed. Men without his grace, his sense of restraint, his understanding of the delicate balance between fear and respect. Yet for those who remembered, for those who had seen his quiet reign unfold, there was a lingering sense that something had been lost when Costello stepped away. He had been the last of his kind, a man who turned the chaos of organized crime into an empire of order. But to truly understand the legacy of Frank Costello, one must go back to the seeds he planted, the influence that spread beyond the walls of smoky back rooms and marble penthouses. His way of doing business changed the very fabric of the underworld. He was the bridge between the raw violence of prohibition and the calculated diplomacy of the post-war mafia. And even after his death, the echoes of his philosophy lived on in unexpected places, among politicians, businessmen, and even law enforcement officials who had once despised him. His name lingered in conversations whispered in corridors of power. Senators who had once taken his calls now remembered him with a strange mix of admiration and fear. They'd recall his composure, the way he spoke with quiet authority, how he made even the most ruthless men pause before crossing him. There was something unnerving about a criminal who didn't need threats to command obedience. Costello had proved that influence could be more powerful than intimidation. That control wasn't always about who had the most men with guns, but who could make a room listen when he spoke. His legacy also lived on through the men he had shaped, directly or indirectly. The underworld was full of his disciples, though few would admit it. Some had learned from his diplomacy, others from his caution, and many from his belief that violence was a failure of intellect. Even Vito Genovese, his greatest rival, had operated under structures that Costello had built. When the Commission, Luciano's creation, was restructured after the war, it was Costello who kept it functioning, who made sure that blood didn't drown the business. He had been the glue that held the Mafia together during its most dangerous years. And when he left, that glue began to dissolve. The 1970s and 1980s were marked by chaos in the Mafia world. The old guard was dying out, and the new generation was reckless, driven by drugs and greed. The heroin trade flooded the streets, breaking one of the oldest rules that Costello and Luciano had agreed upon: stay away from narcotics. It was too risky, too visible. But men like Carmine Galante and later the rising Gambino faction ignored that wisdom. They saw profit where Costello had seen disaster. And as they grew rich, they also grew the full wrath of the government. Wiretaps, surveillance, RICO cases, all of it would have been unimaginable in Costello's time. He had avoided exposure like poison. The new men chased fame like fools. By the mid-1980s, as the Mafia began crumbling under federal indictments, journalists and historians started to look back, to trace the rise and fall of organized crime in America. And in doing so, they rediscovered Frank Costello. They saw in him a contradiction, a criminal who lived by ethics, a power broker who sought stability more than domination. He became a fascination for writers, a symbol of the lost gentleman gangster archetype. Documentaries, books, even films began referencing him, directly or through characters inspired by him. The suave mob boss with the calm voice and sharp mind, the kind who preferred a handshake to a bullet, was Costello's ghost, living on in fiction long after his body had turned to dust. But while the public turned him into myth, those who had truly known him, his friends, his rivals, his wife, understood that beneath the polish, there had always been something darker. Frank Costello had mastered the art of self-control, but it came at a cost. Inside, he had carried a constant weight, the knowledge that every decision he made had consequences that rippled far beyond his own life. Every favor granted, every alliance formed, every betrayal ignored, it all shaped a world where corruption became as natural as breathing. He might have kept the streets cleaner than Genovese or Anastasia, but the rot he fed was just as deep, just quieter. His widow, Loretta, outlived him by several years. After his death, she withdrew almost completely from public life. She gave no interviews, kept no memoirs, and refused every attempt to turn her husband's story into a movie. She understood something that few outsiders did. Frank's real genius wasn't what he did, but what he kept hidden. To expose his story fully would have cheapened it, turned it into entertainment. And for all his flaws, Costello had hated spectacle. He had built his life around the idea that the most powerful men are the ones no one truly sees. The world, of course, didn't stop trying. Hollywood found endless inspiration in men like him. Characters modeled after Frank appeared in films and shows, always embodying that same calm menace, that same air of quiet sophistication. The public couldn't get enough of it, the myth of the civilized criminal. It was a fantasy, of course, but it spoke to something true about Costello, his understanding that crime wasn't just about power, but about perception. He had always known that image was everything. That's why he wore tailored suits, why he spoke softly, why he treated even enemies with courtesy. It wasn't kindness, it was strategy. In the broader scope of American history, Costello's influence extended beyond the Mafia. His deep connections with Tammany Hall and New York's political machine left marks that would last decades. The idea of behind-the-scenes power, that there are always figures in the dark pulling the strings of government, found one of its most perfect embodiments in him. He had shown the world that politics and crime were not opposites, but reflections of each other. Both relied on loyalty, leverage, and the ability to manipulate human nature, and that understanding didn't die with him. It became part of the American psyche, the idea that the real power never stands in the spotlight. You can see it in the cynicism of modern politics, in the corporate boardrooms where deals are made over whiskey and smiles, in the subtle dance between influence and corruption. Costello may have been gone, but his philosophy lived on in the quiet corners of every system built on hierarchy and human greed. There's an irony in that, of course. Frank Costello, who once fought to keep the Mafia invisible, became one of its most enduring faces in death. His legend grew precisely because he never sought it. That was the difference between him and men like Capone or Genovese. They craved attention. He avoided it. And yet, decades later, it's Costello's image, the calm, calculating mind behind the scenes, that endures as the blueprint for what the Mafia once aspired to be. By the 1990s, when most of the old crime families were shadows of themselves, the younger generation of criminals began to idolize the past. They looked at Costello, Luciano, and Lansky as if they were mythic figures, creators of a golden age. But what they failed to grasp was that men like Costello hadn't thrived because of ruthlessness alone. They had thrived because they understood balance. They knew when to act and when to wait, when to speak and when to vanish. It wasn't the blood that made them powerful, it was the patience. If Frank Costello could have seen what became of the world he helped build, he might have felt both pride and disgust. Pride, because his ideas about organization, structure, and strategy had spread far beyond the Mafia, influencing every form of power from politics to business. Disgust, because the code he lived by, the unwritten laws of respect, loyalty, and discretion, had all but vanished. The new world was too loud, too reckless, too desperate. The men who replaced him were consumers of power, not craftsmen of it. Still, his name persisted. Historians began to reassess his place in the hierarchy of crime. Some called him the true architect of the modern Mafia. Others saw him as a corrupt genius who blurred the line between criminal and statesman. But everyone agreed on one thing: Frank Costello was unlike any other. He had managed to hold the reins of the underworld while keeping his hands clean enough to dine with governors. He had walked through fire without burning, and when he finally chose to step away, he did so with his dignity intact, a feat almost no one else in his world ever achieved. In the archives of New York, old FBI files still carry his name. They describe him in cold, bureaucratic language: suspected racketeer, political fixer, probable head of organized gambling operations. But between the lines, you can sense the frustration of the agents who chased him for years and never caught more than smoke. Costello was too smart, too careful, too polished to leave a trail. He existed in a realm beyond the reach of ordinary investigation, protected not by guns but by relationships. There's a story that one retired detective told years later. He had tailed Costello for months in the late 1940s, trying to catch him meeting with known associates. One evening, he followed him to a hotel bar. Costello sat alone at a corner table, sipping a drink, reading a newspaper. The detective sat nearby, waiting for someone to join him. Hours passed, but no one came. Finally, Costello folded the paper, stood up, walked past the detective, and said quietly, "You can stop waiting. The meeting already happened." The detective never forgot it. It was pure Costello, calm, witty, and always 3 steps ahead. Decades later, when the Mafia became a caricature of its former self, riddled with informants, wiretaps, and crumbling loyalty, some of the surviving old-timers would shake their heads and say, "It wasn't like this when Frank was around." To them, he represented the lost art of control, the belief that you could rule an empire without spilling unnecessary blood, that you could be powerful and still walk among the elite without anyone daring to expose you. And maybe that's the greatest irony of all. The man who spent his life in the shadows ended up defining the light by contrast. Every chaotic headline, every public scandal, every bloody power struggle that came after only made his era seem more refined, more intelligent, more deliberate. Frank Costello's life was more than a gangster story. It was a study in human ambition, in how power corrupts not only the soul, but also the system that enables it. He had learned to navigate both worlds, and in doing so, he revealed how closely they mirrored each other. The mafia, politics, business, they were all just different stages of the same play. The actors changed, the stakes evolved, but the script remained the same. Influence, loyalty, leverage, survival. His story is a reminder that evil doesn't always shout. Sometimes it whispers, wears silk, and smiles politely while moving the world like chess pieces. That was Frank Costello, the man who made crime look like civility, and civility look like control. And even now, decades after his death, his name still carries the weight of that paradox. The city has a way of burying its past beneath new towers and brighter lights, but the ghosts always find a way back. In the decades following Frank Costello's death, Manhattan reinvented itself again and again, first as a city of finance, then of culture, then of excess. But beneath all that glitter and reinvention, the bones of his empire still lingered. The nightclubs that once paid tribute in silence, the old brownstones where envelopes passed hands, the hotels where mayors and mobsters shared the same scotch. All of it was still there, hidden in plain sight. People just stopped noticing, or maybe they no longer wanted to. For years, the name Frank Costello faded into whispers, known only to historians and old-timers who remembered what the city felt like before it was sterilized by progress. But the thing about history is that it never really dies. It just waits for the right story to bring it back. By the early 2000s, a new fascination with organized crime had emerged. Films and television shows romanticized the underworld again. The code, the suits, the quiet intelligence that men like Costello embodied. His name resurfaced in documentaries, interviews, even college courses that examined the psychology of power and corruption. To the younger generation, he became a symbol of control in a world obsessed with chaos. But those who had lived through his time, the ones who'd seen him in smoke-filled rooms, who'd heard that calm voice turning enemies into allies, knew that no screen or script could ever truly capture what made him unique. It wasn't just his intellect or his connections. It was something more intangible, a kind of aura. He could walk into a room full of predators and instantly become the center of gravity, not by force, but by presence. Men like that didn't need to shout. They were the storm contained within silence. Long after he was gone, fragments of his influence could still be traced through the city's bloodstream. Certain judges, now retired, had once been young assistants working under men who owed their careers to Costello's introductions. Politicians who prided themselves on clean records still carried family connections that led back, however faintly, to the old Tammany days. And within the surviving circles of organized crime, there remained an unspoken reverence for him, a respect reserved not for what he did, but for how he did it. In the 1980s and 1990s, as the Mafia suffered public humiliation after public humiliation, bosses paraded before cameras, wiretaps playing in open courtrooms, informants turning faster than the government could process them, Costello's methods began to look prophetic. He had always warned that visibility was death. The moment they see your face, he once said, they start imagining your funeral. It was a philosophy built on invisibility, on being indispensable but unseen. The men who ignored that wisdom found themselves immortalized not in power but in mugshots. Even the FBI, which had hunted him for decades, came to respect the elegance of his evasion. In private, retired agents would admit that Costello was a different breed. He wasn't reckless. He didn't crave validation. He was, in many ways, the perfect criminal, not because he was untouchable, but because he understood the art of restraint. He knew when to stop. And that, in the world he inhabited, was the rarest instinct of all. But while the world dissected his legend, the man himself remained an enigma. There were stories about him that blurred the line between truth and myth. Some said he kept a secret ledger hidden somewhere in Manhattan, a record of every politician and businessman who had ever owed him a favor. Others claimed that he had quietly invested in legitimate industries long before retiring, ensuring that even in death his influence would continue to earn interest. And then there were those who swore that certain foundations, charities, and real estate firms that thrived in the 1960s had roots in Costello's money, washed clean and replanted in respectable soil. No one could ever prove any of it, of course. But that was the beauty of Costello's genius. He left just enough behind to make people wonder. He didn't need to be remembered accurately. He just needed to be remembered. There was, however, one story that many who knew him swore was true. In his final years, Frank Costello had developed a strange habit of taking long walks through the city late at night. He'd stroll quietly through Central Park or along Fifth Avenue, hands in his pockets, hat pulled low. Sometimes he would pause in front of a building, a hotel, a restaurant, a theater, and just stand there, looking up at it in silence. When someone once asked him what he was thinking about on those walks, he simply replied, "I'm checking to see if the city still remembers me." It was a haunting thought, that a man who had once controlled the very heartbeat of New York could stand among the noise of traffic and feel forgotten. Yet there was a strange poetry in it, too. Costello had built his empire not for fame, but for influence. And influence, by its very nature, fades from view even as it endures. He didn't want statues or headlines. He wanted permanence in the invisible currents that shaped power. And in that sense, he got exactly what he wanted. By the turn of the millennium, the last of his contemporaries had vanished. The Luciano family, the Genovese family, the Gambinos, all had been restructured, splintered, and battered by the government. The codes of silence that once defined the underworld were broken. Loyalty became currency, and betrayal became the new economy. The quiet, disciplined hierarchy that Costello had once helped create was replaced by greed and desperation. Yet the myth of the old-school boss only grew stronger with every downfall. People longed for the days when power had class, when crime felt like strategy instead of spectacle. In the quiet corners of the city, there were still places that remembered him. The bartender at a certain midtown hotel who had once served him his usual drink, a double scotch neat, kept his favorite glass behind the counter, untouched. A tailor on Madison Avenue still told stories of a man who came in every few months for fittings, who tipped heavily but never spoke more than necessary. And an elderly doorman at the Waldorf Towers, long retired, used to tell his grandchildren about the man with the silver hair and the soft-spoken voice who everyone called Mr. C, though no one dared ask what the C stood for. What set Frank Costello apart from every other figure of his time was his refusal to let his ego dictate his fate. He understood the power of humility, not moral humility, but strategic humility. He knew that survival in his world wasn't about being feared, but about being needed. He made himself the hinge upon which doors quietly turned. Everyone, from gangsters to governors, found themselves indebted to him in some small way. And that web of subtle obligation became his fortress. When others built walls of muscle, he built walls of gratitude. Yet for all his brilliance, there was tragedy in his life too. Beneath the calm exterior, he was a man haunted by contradictions. He longed for legitimacy, but his hands were stained by the very corruption that sustained him. He dreamed of peace, but built his empire in a world that thrived on violence. He tried to civilize the Mafia, but in doing so, only made it more efficient, more entrenched in the institutions it corrupted. It was as if he had tamed a beast, only to realize he had taught it how to wear a suit. If you listen closely in certain parts of New York, you can still feel his ghost moving through the streets. The kind of ghost that doesn't haunt with rattling chains, but with the weight of memory. In the hush between passing taxis, in the flicker of an old neon sign, in the quiet exchange of a handshake behind closed doors, his spirit lingers. Because Costello wasn't just a man. He was an idea that power doesn't have to roar to reshape the world. In the archives of the New York Times, there's a small article dated February 20th, 1973. The headline reads, "Frank Costello dies, Prime Minister of the Underworld." The piece is short, respectful, and almost clinical. It describes his life, his trials, his survival of an assassination attempt, his eventual retreat from the world. But what stands out most is the final line. He lived quietly and died quietly, but his silence was never empty. That single sentence might be the most accurate summary of his existence ever written. It's strange how silence can echo louder than noise when it belongs to the right person. Costello mastered that. He understood that to truly rule, one must learn when to disappear. That's why, even after half a century, his story still feels unfinished. It's not just a tale of crime. It's a study in the art of subtlety, of what it means to move unseen in a world addicted to spectacle. And maybe that's why people keep coming back to his story. Because deep down, we're fascinated by the idea of someone who could possess immense power without losing their composure, who could stand at the heart of corruption and still appear dignified. Frank Costello wasn't a hero, but he wasn't a monster either. He was something far rarer, a man who understood both worlds too well to belong fully to either. If there's one lesson his life leaves behind, it's this: the greatest power isn't in violence or wealth, it's in understanding people. Costello knew what made men tick, what they feared, what they desired, what they would trade for a sense of safety or respect. He didn't rule through terror, he ruled through understanding. And that, more than anything else, is why his influence endured long after his body was gone. He may have walked those streets for the last time in 1973, but in the invisible architecture of New York's power, the quiet deals, the unspoken debts, the way money still moves in the dark, you can still feel his hand guiding the game. History often forgets the quiet men first. The loud ones, the violent ones, the unpredictable men, they burn their names into memory with bullets and blood. But the quiet ones, the ones who work in the margins and let others take the credit, they fade slowly, like a whisper carried by the wind. And yet, every so often, one of those whispers lingers long enough to outlast the noise. Frank Costello was one of those whispers. His name might not be shouted across movie screens like Capone's or Gotti's, but it seeps through the cracks of every story about political corruption, gambling empires, and the golden age of organized crime. He was the phantom behind the curtain. And even after his death, his influence stretched further than anyone could measure. After his passing in 1973, his funeral was a quiet affair, modest, understated, attended by only a few of the old guard who were still alive and brave enough to be seen there. No grand procession, no flowers spelling out boss or don, just a small gathering the way he would have wanted it. The priests spoke about redemption, about the mysterious mercy of God, but everyone in the room knew they were talking about a man who had lived in the gray. Frank Costello wasn't evil, but he wasn't good either. He was human, a man who understood that morality bends easily when power is on the line. In the weeks following his death, there was a strange sense of quiet in New York's underworld. Men who'd spent their entire lives maneuvering, plotting, and betraying suddenly felt as though a stabilizing force had vanished. Costello had been more than a power broker. He was a mediator, a man who believed in order above chaos. He didn't crave domination, he craved control. And control in his mind was about balance. His absence left a vacuum that men like Vito Genovese, even years earlier, had struggled to fill with brute force. When the last of Costello's loyalists faded into retirement or death, that balance dissolved completely. In the following decades, law enforcement dismantled much of the old Mafia hierarchy. The Commission, the organization Costello once helped shape into a council of discipline and reason, crumbled under indictments and betrayals. RICO laws, wiretaps, and hidden cameras made the invisible visible. The old ways of quiet influence and coded respect couldn't survive in a world that now recorded everything. But in the middle of all that collapse, Costello's methods began to find a new audience, not among mobsters, but among politicians and businessmen. His philosophy of power without visibility, control through subtlety, began to mirror the way corporations and political machines operated in the late 20th century. Behind closed doors, the modern titans of industry and politics were applying lessons Costello had lived decades earlier. Influence the powerful. Never be the face of anything dangerous. Stay indispensable but invisible. Let others take the spotlight in the fall. Costello had once said that being a boss wasn't about giving orders. It was about making others believe that what they wanted aligned perfectly with what you wanted. That idea became the unspoken law of modern influence. One night in 1992, a journalist named Martin DeLuca, working on a piece about the forgotten mafia figures of mid-century America, found himself in a small Italian restaurant in the Bronx. He'd been told that an old associate of Costello's still lived nearby, a man who had once worked as a messenger boy during the peak of Costello's reign. The man, well into his 80s, sat at the end of the bar, sipping wine and humming to himself. When DeLuca asked about Costello, the old man chuckled. "Mr. C?" he said, smiling faintly. He wasn't like the others. He didn't yell, didn't curse. He could tell you to go to hell and you'd thank him for the directions. The old man leaned closer. You ever notice how quiet power feels? You don't see it. You just feel it. That was him. You'd walk into a room, and before he even spoke, you'd already decided to listen. DeLuca scribbled in his notebook, but the old man waved him off. "You can't write that kind of thing down," he said. "It won't sound real." You had to be there. You had to see how everyone changed when he walked in. That conversation stuck with DeLuca. He went on to write a series of articles that argued that Frank Costello, not Luciano or Capone, had done the most to modernize organized crime. He compared Costello to a corporate CEO, to a diplomat, to a shadow statesman. The articles received mixed reactions. Some hailed him as a visionary, others dismissed him as an opportunist who hid his crimes behind a polished veneer. But the debate reignited interest in Costello's story, and suddenly, the gentleman of the underworld was back in the public imagination. By the early 2000s, his legacy had entered pop culture again. Filmmakers drew inspiration from him. Characters based loosely on Costello began appearing in movies and TV shows, from The Godfather to The Departed. Yet the dramatizations always exaggerated one side of him, the refined criminal or the fallen philosopher, but never quite captured the full truth, because the real Frank Costello was both, and neither. He was a contradiction walking in a $1,000 suit. What made Costello's story so enduring wasn't his power, but his restraint. In a world of killers, he mastered diplomacy. In an empire built on fear, he built relationships. He didn't rely on guns. He relied on understanding people's weaknesses. He knew that most men could be bought, but the smartest ones preferred to be convinced. And so he became a salesman of trust. Every deal, every alliance, every truce he crafted came with a sense of fairness, at least on the surface. His enemies often found themselves grudgingly respecting him even as they plotted against him. But beneath the sophistication, there was always danger. Costello's calm demeanor masked a mind capable of ruthless calculation. He never pulled a trigger, but his words could end a career, topple an alliance, or turn one friend into another's enemy. His power wasn't in violence, it was in orchestration. He conducted chaos like a maestro, each decision deliberate, each outcome predictable. In a way, he was a man out of time. Born in the slums, rising through an era of brutality, he shaped himself into something closer to a philosopher king of crime. Had he been born in a different era, perhaps as a banker or a senator, he might have achieved the same control without ever breaking the law. But the world he came from didn't allow that kind of transformation. Respect wasn't given to men like Frank Costello. It had to be taken. Even in his later years, when he had withdrawn from active life, his shadow still touched every corner of New York's elite. Rumor had it that certain mayors and state officials still consulted friends of Frank for advice on city contracts or political strategies. There were whispers that a portion of his fortune had been invested in legitimate businesses that grew into major corporations. None of it could ever be proven, but the myth of Costello's invisible empire only grew stronger with time. One of the most telling stories came from a retired cop who claimed to have once been assigned to watch Costello's building in Manhattan in the late 1960s. The officer recalled sitting in a parked car across the street hour after hour, waiting for something, anything to happen. But Costello never slipped. Every move was calculated. The officer remembered seeing Costello exit his apartment one evening, dressed impeccably, stepping into a waiting cab. He looked like a senator, the cop said years later. Not a gangster. You almost felt like you should salute him. The illusion of legitimacy was Costello's armor. He blurred the line between criminal and statesman so effectively that even those hunting him couldn't tell which world he truly belonged to. And perhaps that was the secret. He belonged to both. In his twilight years, Costello often spoke of peace. Friends who visited him said he spent hours tending to his garden, trimming hedges, and watering roses with the same precision he once applied to orchestrating political alliances. There was irony in that image. The man who once dictated the rhythm of New York's criminal underworld, now obsessed with keeping a garden alive. But maybe that was his redemption in small form. He couldn't undo the past, but he could at least nurture something fragile into life. Some say he regretted certain things. Not the money or the power, but the moral erosion that came with it. When you start playing God, he once told a friend, you forget how human you are. There was sadness in that admission, a weariness that came only after decades of pretending to be untouchable, because even the most composed man can't escape the weight of his own decisions. As time moved on, his legend softened. Younger generations, disconnected from the violence and corruption of his era, began to see him as a symbol rather than a criminal. To them, he represented the sophistication of the old world, the class and quiet authority that modern chaos lacked. They quoted him in business seminars, they studied his strategies in leadership courses, never realizing that those lessons were born from a life of crime. Frank Costello became something he might have secretly wanted all along, a myth. Myths aren't remembered for their sins, they're remembered for their symbolism. And in that sense, he achieved immortality. But beneath that myth lies a truth more human than legend ever allows. Costello's story isn't just about power or crime. It's about transformation. It's about a man who rose from nothing, who saw the ugliness of survival and tried to turn it into something almost graceful. He lived in a world where corruption was a currency, yet he carried himself as if decency still mattered. He blurred morality not because he wanted to, but because in his world, purity was impossible. If he were alive today, looking out over a city run by billionaires, corporations, and faceless power, he might smile that faint, knowing smile of his, because he'd recognize it. The same games, the same ambition, the same hunger, only now, played in boardrooms instead of back rooms. And he'd probably think to himself, I was just ahead of my time. Even now, if you walk through Midtown Manhattan at night, past the quiet hotels and the shimmering lights reflected in rain-slicked streets, you can almost imagine him there, an older man in a fedora, coat collar turned up, strolling past the places that once trembled at his name, a ghost not of violence but of elegance. Watching the city he once ruled in silence, because that's the legacy Frank Costello left behind. Not fear, not chaos, but the lingering echo of control. The invisible kind. The kind you don't see until you realize you've been living in its shadow all along. The world moved on, as it always does, swallowing up the men who once ruled it. But every city carries its ghosts, and New York, Frank Costello's city, never forgets entirely. Sometimes on certain nights, the wind moving through the alleys between old brick buildings seems to whisper his name. People who never knew him still walk past the places that bore his mark. The lobbies of hotels where deals were struck. The hidden lounges where senators and gangsters once shared cigarettes. The marble floors of courthouses that echoed with the steps of men who owed him their careers. The modern city with its glass towers and sterile streets might pretend those days are gone, but the foundation still remembers. The bones of New York were poured in corruption, and Costello was one of the architects. Even decades after his death, fragments of his influence resurfaced in strange ways. In the 1980s, when the Mafia's last golden generation fell under the hammer of federal indictments, a few old agents and prosecutors quietly admitted that none of their modern targets were quite like Costello. The men they caught were thugs, attention seekers, addicted to fame and excess. Costello, by contrast, had understood that real power was something quiet, something disciplined. He never let his ego outgrow his control. One retired agent, interviewed years later, said, "If more of them had listened to Costello's way, we might still be chasing shadows instead of headlines." That was the paradox of his legacy. He represented a kind of corruption that was almost noble in its restraint. He believed in rules, even among criminals. To him, chaos was bad business. Violence, greed, impulsive ambition, these were the cancers that destroyed order. His greatest contribution to the underworld wasn't the money or the connections. It was the idea that the Mafia could act like an institution with its own diplomacy, its own decorum. He gave crime a code of civility, and in doing so, he blurred the line between law and lawlessness so thoroughly that, for a time, it was impossible to tell where one ended and the other began. But for all his brilliance, there was a loneliness to Frank Costello that no amount of power could erase. The people closest to him often described a man who was always watching but rarely speaking. Someone who measured every word before releasing it, as if language itself were a weapon. He lived a life surrounded by loyalty, but very little love. His wife Loretta remained by his side until the end, but even she admitted that she never truly knew what was going on inside his mind. He kept his emotions guarded, hidden behind a mask of calm detachment. Those who came to his home for dinners or meetings said it always felt like being in the presence of a man who carried entire empires inside his silence. In one of his last interviews, he was asked if he ever felt remorse. He smiled faintly, the corners of his mouth curling in that signature way that both disarmed and unsettled people. Remorse? He repeated softly. That depends on who you think got hurt. It was an answer that said everything and nothing at once. Costello didn't see morality in simple terms. To him, life was a ledger, debits and credits, debts and payments. Every choice carried a cost, and every man had to decide what price he was willing to pay. As he aged, the violence of the streets receded from his daily life, but the memories didn't. Sometimes he would recall the early days, the chaos of the Prohibition era, the sound of Tommy guns echoing through tenement blocks, the blood in the gutters, and he would shake his head. "We were animals," he once said to a friend over drinks, "but I tried to teach the animals manners." It was a line that captured his entire philosophy. He didn't try to end crime, only to refine it. After his death, historians and journalists argued over how much of his story could be verified. Records were scarce, and many of the people who might have told the truth were either dead or unwilling. Yet, in piecing together his life, one thing became clear. Frank Costello had been a master of reinvention. From a poor Italian immigrant boy named Francesco Castiglia to the sophisticated, Americanized power broker known as the Prime Minister, his transformation wasn't just personal. It was symbolic of the immigrant dream gone wrong, or perhaps the immigrant dream realized in its purest form. He came to America seeking opportunity and found it in the cracks of a corrupt system. When the doors of legitimacy stayed closed, he built his own corridors of power. In many ways, Costello's life was a mirror of America itself, ambitious, ruthless, endlessly adaptable. He rose not because he broke the rules, but because he understood them better than those who wrote them. He didn't fight against the establishment. He infiltrated it. That was his genius. While other gangsters tried to control the streets, Costello controlled the men who owned the streets. He spoke the language of respectability, dressed the part, and learned how to make the corrupt look honorable. It's no wonder that by the end of his life, senators, judges, and mayors treated him like an equal. In 1961, just a decade before his death, a young law student in New York named Anthony Marino began researching political corruption for his thesis. He stumbled upon transcripts from the Kefauver hearings, those infamous congressional investigations where Costello had been forced to testify. Marino was fascinated. Here was a man who had stood before the United States Senate and refused to incriminate himself, not through bluster or defiance, but through calm dignity. When asked what he did for a living, Costello famously replied, "I'm in the real estate business." When pressed further, he simply said, "I make a living." The simplicity of it was mesmerizing. Marino would later write that Costello's silence was more powerful than any confession. He understood that power wasn't about proving your innocence, it was about controlling the conversation. Years later, that same student became a prominent attorney in New York, representing corporations, political campaigns, and even a few men rumored to have mob ties. In private, he admitted that everything he knew about negotiation and persuasion he had learned from studying Costello's testimony. He was the blueprint, Marino said in an interview before his death. He showed us that control isn't about shouting the loudest, it's about making others want to listen. Stories like that became part of Costello's afterlife. Every decade, someone rediscovered him, peeled back another layer, and found something new. To law enforcement, he was a criminal mastermind. To politicians, he was a cautionary tale. To businessmen, he was a strategist ahead of his time. And to storytellers, he was a paradox, a villain who behaved like a gentleman, a crook with class, a man whose empire was built not on blood, but on persuasion. The more people tried to define him, the more he eluded definition. Maybe that was intentional. Maybe Costello understood that a clear reputation is a fragile thing, but ambiguity can last forever. It gives people room to fill in the blanks, to turn a man into a myth. And that's what happened to him. He became whatever the world needed him to be. Even in death, he never truly vanished. There are whispers that certain real estate holdings in Manhattan still trace their origins to shell companies tied to him. Some claim his fortune was quietly absorbed into charitable foundations, the money scrubbed clean over time. There are unconfirmed reports of Swiss bank accounts, of anonymous donations to Catholic institutions, even of political funds that seemed to appear out of nowhere in the 1970s and 1980s. No proof, no records, just shadows. Exactly how he liked it. And in the digital age, when information became the new weapon, Costello's methods found new disciples. Tech billionaires, media moguls, and political strategists studied figures like him to understand how to wield influence without exposure. The art of staying visible enough to be respected, but invisible enough to be untouchable. That was the Costello doctrine, repackaged for the 21st century. But perhaps the most haunting part of his story isn't how much of him remains. It's how much of him we'll never know. There are letters that vanished, associates who took secrets to their graves, deals made over whiskey that were never written down. He built a world of invisible strings, and when he died, most of those strings went slack, their ends lost to time. What survives are fragments, newspaper clippings, old photographs, testimonies from men long dead. Yet when you piece them together, a portrait emerges, not of a monster, but of a man who mastered the impossible art of living between worlds. Frank Costello wasn't born to rule. He was born to survive. Everything he became was a reaction to a world that offered him no mercy. Maybe that's what made him so dangerous. He never forgot where he came from, but he refused to let it define him. He learned the rules of the upper class not to join them, but to beat them at their own game. Toward the end of his life, as his health declined, a reporter asked him what he thought about the new generation of gangsters who used violence as their primary weapon. Costello sighed, a weary sound that carried decades of disappointment. "They don't understand the game," he said. "You don't win by being feared. You win by being trusted." That single sentence summed up his philosophy better than any biography ever could. To him, power wasn't about domination, it was about perception. The tragedy of Frank Costello was that he lived too long to see his world unravel. The system he built, the fragile balance of corruption and control, couldn't survive the greed of those who came after him. The new generation traded patience for notoriety, subtlety for spectacle, and when the government finally crushed them, it was as if they were erasing the last traces of his design. But history, as it often does, has a way of circling back. The modern world, with its quiet manipulation, its hidden deals, its polished criminals in tailored suits, feels eerily like the one Costello once ruled. Only now the stakes are global. In the end, maybe Frank Costello's greatest trick wasn't how he lived, but how he lingered. His fingerprints are still on the architecture of power, seen and unseen. He taught the world that the most dangerous kind of man isn't the one who makes threats, but the one who makes promises. The kind who smiles while he's rewriting the rules. The kind who never has to raise his voice to make the world listen. And if he could see it all now, the noise, the chaos, the illusion of progress, he'd probably just smile, pour himself a scotch, and whisper, "They still don't get it." In the twilight of his life, Frank Costello spent his days in quiet reflection, surrounded by the trappings of a man who had once held the city in his palm, but no longer felt the need to prove it. His apartment on Central Park West was a place of contradictions, lavish but understated, elegant but somehow haunted by an air of solitude. The furniture gleamed with age, the walls bore the scent of cigars long burned out, and the view of the park below stretched endlessly, a living reminder of how much the city had changed since he first arrived as a poor boy from Calabria. He often stood by the window in the early morning hours, a glass of whiskey in his hand, staring out at the skyline that had once been his kingdom. The lights shimmered like scattered gold, and sometimes he would smirk softly to himself, as though remembering a joke only he could understand. He was an old man now, his once carefully polished hair thin and gray, his sharp eyes dulled but still observant. The years had not been kind, but they had not broken him either. The bullet from the attempt on his life had taken more from him than he admitted. It had left him paranoid, uneasy, aware of how close he had come to slipping into the darkness he'd long evaded. But Costello wasn't the type to live in fear. He adapted as he always had. He reduced his public appearances, tightened his circle, and became a shadow of himself by design. It was not defeat. It was evolution. Visitors who came to see him in those years found a man who spoke little of the past, preferring instead to talk about the world as it was becoming. Politics fascinated him, even in retirement. He watched every election, every scandal, every shifting alliance with the detached curiosity of a man who already knew how the story would end. When the Watergate scandal broke, he read about it daily, laughing at the irony that politicians who had once condemned men like him were now caught in webs of their own deceit. "They should have called me," he once muttered to a friend. I'd have taught them how to keep quiet. He lived modestly, or at least as modestly as a man like Frank Costello could. His fortune, though still substantial, was no longer what it had once been. Much of it had been hidden or invested under names that no longer existed, lost in the tangled paper trails of offshore accounts and forgotten partnerships. But that didn't bother him. Money, after all, had never been his true pursuit. It had been the tool, not the prize. What mattered to him was the game, the art of persuasion, the balance of fear and respect, the mastery of human nature. In his old age, he had begun to see himself not as a criminal, but as a kind of philosopher who had studied the machinery of power more deeply than any professor or priest ever could. Some evenings, he would receive a few trusted visitors, old associates, a retired judge, a newspaper columnist who still owed him favors, sometimes even young men from the old neighborhoods who came seeking advice. He would listen to them talk about the state of the world, the decline of the old Mafia, the rise of drugs, the chaos that had replaced structure, and he would sigh. "They've lost the code," he'd say quietly. "They don't understand the business anymore. It's not about bullets. It's about trust." Those who spent time with him during those final years often left feeling as if they had been in the presence of something ancient and fading, like a relic from another civilization. Costello had that effect on people. He seemed to belong to another era entirely. Even when his body grew frail, his voice retained that calm authority that could still command attention. He never raised it, never needed to. The power that once ruled over judges and senators was still there, dormant but unmistakable, like embers that refused to die out. He had become reflective about mortality, though never sentimental. Religion, which had once been more a matter of culture than conviction, began to occupy his thoughts again. He would sometimes attend Mass quietly, sitting in the back pew where few recognized him. To the young priest who saw him there week after week, he was just an elderly Italian man with kind eyes and a face that seemed vaguely familiar. If the priest ever learned who he truly was, he never said. One evening after the service, Costello lingered a moment and asked, "Father, do you think a man who's done bad things can still have peace?" The priest smiled gently and said, "Peace doesn't come from being good, my son. It comes from knowing what you've done and asking for forgiveness." Costello nodded, but he didn't respond. He had made his peace in his own way, quietly, without confession, without theatrics. He believed in balance, not absolution. There were moments when his past would return to him in dreams, the roar of gunfire in the alleys of Prohibition-era Manhattan, the laughter of Lucky Luciano echoing in a smoky club, the chill of the courtroom during the Kefauver hearings. Sometimes he would wake up in the middle of the night, his heart pounding, the smell of cordite still clinging to his mind. But then he would take a deep breath, pour himself a drink, and remind himself that those ghosts no longer had power over him. He had outlived them all. Luciano was dead, Lansky was gone, Genovese had rotted in prison. Even the men who had once feared or hated him were now buried, their names fading into history. Costello had survived them all, and survival, for him, had always been the ultimate victory. As the years passed, the world outside his apartment continued to evolve. The Mafia that once ruled the streets of New York had become a shadow of its former self, fractured by greed and law enforcement crackdowns. The old codes of honor had dissolved, replaced by reckless ambition and the poison of narcotics. Costello read the headlines with quiet contempt. He saw the new generation of mobsters parading their wealth, flaunting their crimes, making themselves targets. He understood that their downfall wasn't a matter of if, but when. "They want to be seen," he told a friend one afternoon. The moment you want to be seen, you've already lost. That philosophy, his philosophy, was what had kept him alive for so long. He understood that true power didn't shout. It whispered. It moved behind the curtains, unseen but unstoppable. It was the kind of power that didn't need guns or threats, only influence and patience. The men who forgot that truth were doomed to destroy themselves, as so many had. In 1973, when word reached him that Carlo Gambino, the last of the truly old-school bosses, had passed away, Costello sat quietly for a long time. He didn't speak, didn't pour a drink, didn't move. Finally, he whispered, "That's the end of it then." And he was right. The world they had built, the world of order amid crime, of discipline amid chaos, was gone. All that remained were echoes. He spent his final years surrounded by a few loyal aides and his wife, Loretta, who stood by him despite the decades of silence and secrets. They had no children, no heirs to carry his name. Perhaps that was for the best. He had never believed that power could be inherited. It had to be earned, shaped, controlled. Still, Loretta worried about what would happen to him when the end came. "Frank," she once asked softly, "do you ever think about how you'll be remembered?" He looked at her for a long time before answering. "I don't care if they remember me," he said. "I just care that they remember how the world used to be when men kept their word." In March 1973, at the age of 82, Frank Costello passed away quietly in his sleep. There were no grand funerals, no public mourning. His death made the newspapers, of course, but the coverage was brief and strangely respectful. Frank Costello, reputed underworld figure and political power broker, dies at 82, one headline read. Beneath it, a few paragraphs recounted his career, his brush with the law, and his eventual withdrawal from public life. There was no mention of the whispered deals, the politicians who owed him their positions, or the silent network of favors that had shaped New York for decades. Those details died with him. His funeral was small and private, attended by a handful of family members, old associates, and one or two men who looked far too careful to ever have been on the record. They buried him in St. Michael's Cemetery in Queens, beneath a modest stone bearing only his name and the years of his life. No epitaph, no hint of who he truly was, just Frank Costello. In death, as in life, he preferred understatement. Yet, for all its simplicity, his grave became something of a pilgrimage site for a certain kind of visitor. Young men from the old neighborhoods would stop by, leave a cigar or a coin, and whisper stories they'd heard from their fathers or grandfathers. Some came seeking luck, others respect. A few simply wanted to stand where history slept. Over time, the legend of Frank Costello grew, not as a criminal, but as a symbol of a lost era when power was something quiet, refined, and terrifyingly effective. Historians continued to debate his role for decades afterward. Some painted him as a corrupt manipulator who blurred the lines between government and organized crime. Others saw him as a necessary evil, a man who maintained balance in a world that was always on the verge of chaos. There were even those who called him a statesman of the underworld, an ironic but oddly fitting title. He would have liked that one. The myths surrounding him only deepened as the years passed. A few journalists tried to uncover the full extent of his political reach, but every investigation ended in dead ends and sealed archives. The truth was buried under too many layers of silence, too many favors owed, too many people willing to forget. Even in the age of digital transparency, Costello remained a ghost, but his influence never truly vanished. You could see traces of him in the polished smiles of modern politicians, in the quiet deals made behind closed doors, in the unspoken understanding that money and power were languages more universal than law or morality. Every time a corporation bent the rules without breaking them, every time a politician accepted help from a shadowy donor and pretended it didn't exist, Frank Costello's ghost smiled somewhere. He had proven that the machinery of corruption could be made elegant, and once that door was opened, it could never truly be closed again. Somewhere in the archives of old FBI files, there's a handwritten note by an agent who worked on Costello's case in the 1950s. It reads, "He is not like the others. He is not dangerous because of what he does, but because of what he knows." That line may be the most accurate summation of his legacy. Costello's real weapon was knowledge, the understanding of people, institutions, and the fragile balance that keeps them from collapsing. He understood that fear can control men for a moment, but respect controls them forever. If there is any justice in history, it lies not in who wins or loses, but in who is remembered. And Frank Costello, the immigrant boy who became the prime minister of the underworld, is still remembered. Not with affection, perhaps, but with a kind of dark admiration. He was proof that civilization and corruption are often two sides of the same coin, and that sometimes the most civilized man in the room is also the most dangerous. The city he once ruled has changed beyond recognition, but under the surface, his legacy still hums like a hidden current. Power still flows through favors, influence still triumphs over law, and silence, Costello's greatest weapon, remains the mark of true authority. In the end, the story of Frank Costello is not just the story of a gangster. It's the story of America itself. Ambition cloaked in respectability, corruption dressed in civility, power disguised as order. And perhaps that's why his name still lingers, like the faint echo of a long-forgotten melody that refuses to fade. The story of Frank Costello did not end with his death. If anything, that's when his myth began to take root. In the years after his passing, his name became a kind of whisper in the corridors of power, a legend carried by men who claimed to have known him, done business with him, or learned from his example. They spoke of him not as a brute or a thug, but as a man who had refined the machinery of crime until it resembled governance itself. To some, he was the last of the gentleman gangsters, a figure of dignity amid a world of savages. To others, he was proof that the line between politics and the underworld had never truly existed, only blurred. Either way, his shadow remained, stretching long across the decades that followed. In the smoky back rooms of clubs that still played Sinatra on worn-out jukeboxes, old men would talk about him the way scholars talk about a lost philosopher. They'd recall how he carried himself, how he dressed in tailored suits even when visiting the docks, how he spoke with that measured calm that could silence a room. He didn't need to shout, one would say, taking a slow drag of his cigarette. He just looked at you and you knew. His power wasn't in violence, it was in poise. That was what set him apart from the next generation of gangsters who would emerge in the decades after him, loud and reckless, chasing headlines instead of influence. When men like John Gotti began to dominate the underworld in the 1980s, many of the older mobsters shook their heads. Too flashy, they'd say. Too proud. They remembered Costello's warnings about the dangers of visibility, about how the greatest weapon was invisibility. Power is like smoke, he had once told a young associate. You can feel it, smell it, even choke on it, but you can't hold it. The moment you try, it slips through your fingers. That line became almost scripture in certain circles, quoted with reverence, as though it had come from some forgotten gospel of the underworld. Historians tried to piece together his legacy, but the truth was that Frank Costello had buried his secrets well. The FBI had files, of course, thousands of pages documenting his connections, his influence, the politicians he may have bought, the rackets he may have run. But even those files read like the notes of men chasing smoke. They had evidence of what he touched, but never of how he did it. He had built a system so subtle that by the time anyone noticed his hand, it was already gone. In many ways, Costello was less a man than a method. That method, calm manipulation, strategic restraint, control through civility, became a model for a new kind of criminal enterprise. Long after the Mafia's golden era had faded, his philosophy lived on in boardrooms and political back channels. Corporate leaders studied him without even knowing it. Lobbyists, consultants, and power brokers who never set foot in Little Italy operated with his same principles. Never threaten, never show desperation, and always make others believe that helping you is helping themselves. Costello had turned corruption into an art of persuasion, and that art became the unspoken foundation of modern influence. In film and television, his ghost reappeared under different names. Characters like Vito Corleone and Tony Soprano carried echoes of him. The calm tone, the emphasis on family and respect, the distaste for unnecessary violence. Writers who crafted those stories drew inspiration from real history, and Costello's fingerprints were everywhere in that history. Even Martin Scorsese, in his later films, seemed to chase the essence of men like Costello, the elegant monster, the rational devil, the man who could talk about loyalty with one hand while signing a betrayal with the other. The world had come to romanticize him, to paint him as something more than a gangster. He became a myth of control, a symbol of order amid chaos. But beneath the myth, the truth was darker and far more human. Costello's genius lay not in his morality, but in his understanding of human weakness. He knew that men could be bought, not just with money, but with respect, validation, and the illusion of choice. He learned that people were less afraid of evil than they were of irrelevance. So he made himself necessary. That was his greatest skill. Whether it was a politician needing campaign funds, a cop needing a favor, or a rival needing peace, Costello positioned himself as the solution. It was a lesson in survival that extended beyond the streets. The story of his life became required reading for a new generation of thinkers, criminologists, political scientists, even sociologists. who saw in his story a reflection of the human condition. They debated whether he was a villain or a visionary, a manipulator or a master strategist. Some called him a Machiavellian genius, others a moral void wrapped in charm. But all agreed on one thing: he was effective. He achieved what few men in his world ever did. He retired alive, wealthy, and unbroken. And yet, for all his success, his story carried a melancholy tone. He had built his empire on influence, not love. He had no children, no protégés who truly understood him, no legacy of blood or mentorship to carry his name forward. In a sense, he had outlived everyone but himself. The world that came after him was louder, more brutal, less disciplined. The elegance he had imposed on crime vanished, replaced by greed and impatience. The Mafia's downfall was inevitable, he had once predicted, because they had traded respect for ego. Time proved him right. By the 1990s, federal racketeering laws had dismantled the old families, and the once feared bosses were reduced to footnotes in history books. Yet Costello's story continued to surface in the strangest of places. A senator caught in a bribery scandal, a Wall Street executive accused of insider trading, a tech billionaire manipulating regulations through political donations, all seemed to echo his methods, his philosophy of quiet power. They moved money the way he once moved votes. They understood what he had always known. Power was not about control. It was about access. The rules may have changed, but the game remained the same. In certain circles, there was even a sense of nostalgia for him. Costello would have done it better, people would say when a scandal erupted or a negotiation collapsed. He had become the standard for corruption with dignity, a strange compliment for a man who had spent his life straddling legality and crime. But perhaps that was the irony of his life, that in his quest to humanize the underworld, he had revealed how inhuman the upper world could be. There's a story, perhaps apocryphal, perhaps true, about a young journalist who, years after Costello's death, tracked down one of his old associates in Florida. The man was in his 90s, frail but sharp. When asked what he remembered most about Costello, he smiled and said, "He made you forget you were doing something wrong. That's his trick. He made sin feel civilized." The journalist pressed him for details, how Costello made his deals, how he managed to control so many without bloodshed. But the old man just laughed. "You don't understand," he said. "It wasn't about control. It was about trust. Everyone trusted Frank because he never made them feel like they were being used, even when they were." That single quote summed up a lifetime of mastery, even today. Decades after his death, his influence is felt in ways most people would never recognize. The quiet fixer behind a mayoral campaign, the discreet donor smoothing a political crisis, the corporate mediator who can make billion-dollar disputes disappear, all of them, knowingly or not, are walking in the shadow of Frank Costello. His methods have simply evolved with the times, wrapped now in legality and professionalism, hidden behind titles like consultant, strategist, and advisor. What was once the domain of gangsters has become the framework of politics and business. The only difference is the suits are now better tailored and the crimes have fancier names. It's easy to see why Costello's life continues to fascinate storytellers. He was neither saint nor monster, but something more complex, a mirror reflecting the compromises that define power. He understood that morality was often a luxury that men in his position couldn't afford. He once told a friend, "In this life, you don't choose between right and wrong. You choose between what works and what doesn't." That pragmatic philosophy, stripped of illusion, still echoes in boardrooms, campaigns, and backdoor negotiations. And yet, for all the fascination, one can't help but wonder if he ever truly found peace. Did he ever look back and regret the lives ruined by his decisions, the corruption he normalized, the lines he blurred? Or did he die believing that he had simply played the game better than anyone else? Perhaps the answer lies somewhere in between. Those who knew him best said that in his final years, there was a sadness in his eyes, a sense that he had seen too much, known too much, and lost too much to ever truly rest. If there is a lesson to draw from his life, it is not one of glory, but of caution. Power, no matter how refined, leaves a shadow, and Frank Costello's shadow stretches across every institution that ever thought itself immune to corruption. He proved that civilization itself can be bent if one knows which strings to pull, and that sometimes the most dangerous men are not the ones with guns, but the ones with charm, restraint, and a phone book full of names. As history continues to unfold, His name occasionally resurfaces in documentaries, podcasts, and late-night conversations between men who still believe in codes and loyalty. They speak of him not as a villain, but as an architect, a man who built a bridge between the criminal and the legitimate and dared to walk it. He showed the world that respect and fear are often born of the same seed, and that power, when worn with grace, can disguise almost any sin. And so, his story lingers, a ghost story whispered through time. The immigrant boy who rose from nothing, who ruled an empire without firing a gun, who outsmarted his enemies and outlived his allies. A man who made corruption look like sophistication and deceit feel like diplomacy. Frank Costello remains one of history's great paradoxes, a criminal who became a gentleman, and a gentleman who became a legend. His life stands as a testament to the idea that the true underworld isn't beneath the city, it's within it. In the offices, in the marble halls, in the deals made with a smile and a handshake, Costello understood that better than anyone. He didn't conquer the system, he became part of it. And that perhaps is the darkest truth of all. If you've journeyed with us through this tale of elegance and corruption, remember, history's shadows are never far behind us. The stories of men like Frank Costello remind us that power, once gained, never truly disappears. It simply changes form. If you enjoyed this story, make sure to subscribe for more tales from the shadows of history, because the next story may just show how deep those shadows truly go.